I was thinking, and this will be my final question. By way of analogy to Voltaire and Bakunin's debate, would it be worth asking the soul question? Namely, if the soul does not exist, should we invent it? And I'm using the terms soul here in a way similar to how it was defined by the psychologist James Hillman, as a distinctive, innate, irreplaceable perspective which human beings develop over their lifetime, somewhat analogous to genomic potential, which, irrespective of their differences in character, although it's related to them, makes them uniquely valuable both as individuals and as a collective when compared with other forms of life. That was my brief definition. And James Hillman, the psychologist, had another definition. He said it's a perspective rather than a substance, a viewpoint toward things rather than a thing itself. So we have a lot of discussions about uploading consciousness and all that kind of thing, and not a lot about asking ourselves which aspects of consciousness are those which are, and specifically which aspects of the legacies of people and the memories we have of people are most worth either preserving, culturally preserving, or digitally preserving, like uploading to the cloud type of thing. And we discussed briefly this idea of the value of human beings based on our ignorance of their potential value. I wonder if it might be worth us engaging in what James Hillman calls soul making, but I'm also adapting to mean something technical, which would be a kind of encryption of the person's lifespan potential, such that there is a basis for the universal consideration of interests other than our shared genomic inheritance. Because if through data science we have greater interest of people's lifespan potential, that could become a basis for a very dangerous type of inegalitarianism. Likewise, if we have class-based speciation based on breakthroughs in medical science driven by AI, people's financial differences translate into biological, there's speciation along class lines. This could effectively overturn our shared genetic inheritance as a basis for the universal consideration of equal rights. And so creating something like a soul that is somehow a more concrete basis for the universal recognition of our shared humanity, number one, and an equal consideration of people's interests. Is the soul metaphor something worth considering as a project?
Yeah, well, that is an interesting question. In terms of how you've defined it using the language of Hillman, I think I would be inclined to refer to that as a self or something similar. I know that I think I understand some of the reasons for using a perhaps stronger and more resonating term like soul. I personally am, let me take a step back from that. So I think where we at least are going to be in agreement is that the traditional, at least Western conception of soul as having some sort of immaterial substance that transcends the body and that survives death and is probably made by God and a bunch of other things is not a sustainable, well, I shouldn't say sustainable, that is not a defensible viewpoint in today's day and age. I mean, there are some people who try to defend it, but I don't think it's very wise to do so. So I think that should be rejected. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to reject the notion of souls or the term completely. So the question then is, do we think that we should pursue some kind of reformist conception of souls and preserve it in a maybe modified form, or do we think that it's something that we should just discard as being too problematic?
And the question is it the baby in the bathwater that people are afraid of throwing out with religion?
Yes, essentially that's what it amounts to. I am open to this notion of a reforming conception because I think that's actually a lot of what we need to do in philosophy. We start with a hodgepodge of folk intuitions and misconceptions, and we need to try to rationalize those, unify them into a logical framework which is consistent with science. And a lot of the times there has to be changes made that alter things from how we sort of naively or intuitively understand them. I mean, we see this a lot from the history of physics and other sciences as well as philosophy. My concern there is that there are limits to how far one can go before the concept is so divorced from its sort of pre-theoretic traditional conceptions that it just isn't tenable to maintain the same terminology anymore. And I worry that that's the case for the soul. Now, this is largely an empirical question about what you can sort of get away with in terms of soul talk and bring people along with you.
Mm-hmm.
I am very uncomfortable with soul talk, even in a reformed sense, just because I don't know how well those sort of reformist conceptions are being communicated to people. I still think that in a Western context, it carries too much of those sort of pre-scientific folk intuitions of substance dualism or of transcendence or of some component that's our true essence, that's essentializing. I think that's one issue, but also that is sort of independent from any physical substrate. I think that there are a lot of problems inherent in those beliefs, and I don't want to say it's impossible to have a reformist conception of the soul that avoids those, but I'm rather skeptical, and I don't know if we can get there. And I lean towards thinking that it might be better to just use a different term for what we want to do. But I don't know. I'm ultimately open
it's
to being
interesting.
convinced here.
You came back to dualisms, and we do live in a time. Yeah. We do live in a time of new dualisms. There is the bio self, for instance, and the data self. The person you are, the image you can construct for yourself, and which is constructed of others, which is more than a public persona, but it is now also things like digital profiles with governments and corporations, different credit scores, all that kind of thing. And then there is also, of course, the person you were in life and in death. Ours is a unique time in which the legacy which you leave behind it's far easier to create and preserve this legacy digitally. And so the question of which aspect of the person's life and or consciousness is worth ennobling, concentrating on, preserving is an interesting one.
Well, yeah, and that's a very worthy question. I guess one of the issues there is what language do we use to talk about that?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So Hillman tried to re-envision psychology as soul-making. And he had this idea that my definition of soul-making, summarizing his definition, is that it's a self-generative, imaginative process by which the individual is ennobled with a mythopoetic account of themselves, specifically the soul providing an account for itself. So it's self-generative and self-referential, whose relational dimension re-envisions and thereby recovers the world as a place of soul. So there's this all-encompassing definition. It is kind of more of an animistic idea of soul than a monotheistic, animistic or polytheistic. In any case, so yes, there's a terminology and specifics. There's a lot to discuss there. But I think from an existential point of view, the cumulative threats which are posed by emerging technologies, specifically artificial and general intelligence, and the two dual threats that I'm concerned by, you know what? No, I'll put aside the two, just the one threat of class-based speciation, the translation of existing structural advantages like market power, physical and digital capital, into effectively irreversible genetic advantages bought through earlier access to high-cost augmentation, resulting in speciation, where the resultant social classes avoid or become incapable of interbreeding. That might sound like a wild science fiction idea, but I do think it is within the realm of possibility and has a historical precedent in things like racialism as an ideology.
Yes,
I think the real world threats we're facing as a consequence of the exponential rate of technological change means that the soul question or soul questions, or perhaps more generally psychological questions, should take precedence over the question of God's existence and related theological concerns. That is my tentative conclusion at this stage. That's how I feel.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say a word on that, which is, I'm not entirely comfortable with the soul language as we've just discussed, but in terms of the broader project of trying to identify what it is about, I guess, humans that makes us unique, makes us valuable, that we think we should focus on preserving and valuing through technological and social means. I think that that's an extremely important project. I mean, it's not directly, but it's indirectly one of the things I work on in my research, which is I study language in particular and how humans think and reason. And I think that's a very important part of human existence. And so I'm very interested in these sorts of questions from a sort of scientific point of view, as well as a philosophical point of view. I would also say that the God question is connected here in part because many people, well, in discussing these sorts of issues, whether it's in the language of souls or selves or something else, one is inevitably going to encounter religious perspectives, including traditional religious perspectives that are quite deeply entrenched, and people will defend, or at least some people will defend quite vigorously. And I think that it is one of the things we will have to do as a society, some societies more than others perhaps, is to continue to critically evaluate and I would say argue against these, at least many of these traditional religious perspectives, in order to then progress the discussion to those issues that you've highlighted. I think it's difficult to really move forward as a society, as a species, even when we still have to deal with, put it bluntly, people who think that the Earth was created 6,000 years ago. That's just one specific example, but there's a cluster of a bunch of beliefs, not just that one, but a lot of things relating to that, which are grounded in certain religious conceptions, which make it quite difficult, I think, to move the conversation onto where it needs to be. And so I think that you still, if you want to think of pursuing the sort of soul question as you describe it, as where we're needing to advance towards, we also need to fight, if you like, a rearguard action against those who are sort of left behind with these, I would say, sort of outdated conceptions and are trying to impede us in various ways from discussing these issues.
It is politically complicated, though, because there's
yes, of course.
There's also, I mean, there was an alliance between fascism and traditional forms of Christianity in the early 20th century. There has since become a rift between the two. And it's fair to say the Catholic Church is very progressive today compared to where it was 100 years ago, especially if you look at the Christian church's political wings in Western Europe, like the Christian Democratic Party in Germany and Austria are quite progressive. So, I mean...
Yes, well, I'm not talking about them, but yeah, I mean, it's a strange world when... No, go ahead.
Well, but I mean, American Christianity does, and the Anglo-Saxon world tends to skew our view of Christianity, I think, a bit.
Oh, absolutely true. But what I was going to say is it's a strange world where many American conservatives apparently look to strongmen in Russia for, I guess, moral guidance or perhaps a view of what the state should look like more so than they do to the Vatican. That is quite an interesting development. I mean, obviously there's been anti-Catholic prejudice in the US as well. But I mean, the point is that recent political developments have upended a lot of traditional political affiliations and associations. And I agree with you. I'm not intending to cast an overly wide net in my description about sort of outdated traditional religious beliefs. And I recognize that they're only a minority within Christianity, and they are perhaps more focused in the Anglosphere. But one of the issues is because of the position of America in particular as a political and economic and cultural leader, they have very outsized impacts. And so I think that it is important because developments in America have so much of an effect elsewhere that when conservative political and religious ideologies form a strange unholy alliance in the US and gain social and political power because of that, that has flow-on effects everywhere else. And so I do think that it's not enough to address those on socio-political terms, but also we need to address some of the theological and philosophical beliefs that underpin the beliefs of at least many of these people who support these policies. Yes,
the American influence thing has been true, but interestingly, in terms of religion, in terms of Christianity, it's increasingly, American Catholics don't have some hegemonic power over the Catholic Church, for instance.
Yeah.
Protestantism has always been a fractious collection of... Anyway,
yes.
My view of things, very briefly, is that if we, the people, philosophers or otherwise, don't contend with the threats of emerging technologies, AI, transhumanism, etc., the fear that could generate could push moderate, religious, conservative-oriented people into a fascistic direction as a kind of alternative, with AGI and technology in general becoming increasingly demonized. And so trying to solve the problems posed by technology, I think, is a more urgent problem than dealing with the legacy problems of superstition and authoritarianism inherited by religion, because I think if we don't solve the new and emerging problems, the old ones will get worse.
Well, I think it'll be harder to solve. It's harder to solve these new problems precisely because of these old problems that haven't gone away. So I see them as bound together. But of course, we need to press. I think we need efforts on both of them.
Yes,
not just the one.
They are bound together in a surprising way.